In the gritty streets of Hamilton, Ontario, where steel mills forged the city's industrial backbone, another kind of empire was being built, one of fear, power, and unwavering control. For decades, one name echoed through the shadows of this Canadian city, Johnny "Pops" Papalia. From humble beginnings in an immigrant family to becoming one of Canada's most notorious crime bosses, Papalia's iron grip on Hamilton's underworld would shape the city's criminal landscape for generations. But in the end, like many who lived by the sword, his story would end in violence outside his own office. This is the tale of Canada's Godfather, a story of power, betrayal, and the price of ruling an empire built on fear. Introduction and overview. Johnny "Pops" Papalia stands as one of the most significant and notorious figures in Canadian Mafia lore. His name became synonymous with Hamilton, Ontario's underworld during the mid to late 20th century. Although he was not the only organized crime boss to operate in the region, he nonetheless left an indelible mark on the area's criminal landscape, shaping gambling rings, overseeing loan-sharking operations, and forging connections that ranged far beyond local streets. Papalia was part of a broader network of mafia-oriented families that dotted both Canadian and American cities. As a direct result, his sphere of influence extended well beyond Hamilton's borders. Spanning years of power struggles and shifting allegiances, his life and death encapsulate the tumult of organized crime, a realm in which silence is prized, loyalty can shift abruptly, and danger lurks for both rivals and allies. Papalia's story underscores the cultural tensions in southern Ontario, a region bearing rich immigrant roots that combined old-world traditions with new-world opportunity, both legitimate and illicit. Despite considerable interest from law enforcement and the media, many details of Papalia's personal life, particularly his early childhood, remain cloaked in uncertainty. This secrecy reflects the Mafia's code of omerta, a ritualized vow of silence that discourages members from revealing internal workings under any circumstance. Consequently, Papalia's biography is often pieced together from public records, like court transcripts, law enforcement statements, newspaper articles, and the recollections of family acquaintances. These records, while vast, do not always align neatly, thereby leaving historians and crime researchers with partial or contested information. This biography attempts to separate verifiable historical facts from speculation. Inevitably, some mysteries endure. However, there is no doubting the scope of Papalia's impact on the Canadian underworld. His life unfolded against the backdrop of a growing, dynamic Hamilton, an industrial town that by the mid-1900s was on the cusp of serious transformation. Within that transformative environment, Papalia carved out a reputation for intimidation and cunning, reinforcing his leadership and forming the nucleus of a syndicate that spanned provincial lines. Early life and family background. While various accounts list different birth years for Johnny Papalia, some sources assert he was born in 1924, while others suggest the early 1930s or 1941, it is widely acknowledged that he was born in Hamilton, Ontario, to first-generation Italian immigrant parents. His father, Antonio, often known as Tony, is said to have played a role in the illicit liquor trade during the Prohibition era, when bootlegging to the United States was a lucrative venture. Hamilton's strategic location near the U.S. border made it a hotbed for alcohol smuggling, and this early environment might have shaped the family's association with organized crime. The specific details of Papalia's upbringing, such as the economic challenges his family faced or the influence of older relatives, remain difficult to verify. Nonetheless, anecdotal evidence suggests that his immediate environment primed him for a life in the underworld. Rumors point to Tony Papalia's familiarity with mafia figures who established themselves in Canada during the early 20th century. If these connections existed, Johnny would have been exposed from a young age to the unwritten rules of the criminal underworld: respect, secrecy, and the reality of ruthless violence. Historic Hamilton had a large Italian-Canadian community, many of whose residents were recent immigrants. Like other immigrant enclaves across North America, these communities grappled with discrimination and limited economic opportunities, which sometimes pushed individuals toward illicit enterprises. Against this backdrop, Young Papalia likely witnessed gambling dens, loan sharks operating under the radar, and small-scale smuggling. For some, these operations represented an alternative route to financial stability and a destructive cycle of violence that law enforcement frequently struggled to suppress. Hamilton's underworld context. Before delving deeper into Papalia's personal ascent, it is helpful to understand Hamilton's underworld context. Located on the western tip of Lake Ontario, Hamilton's position near both Toronto and the U.S. border rendered it a strategic link in transnational crime. Starting in the early 20th century, a wave of Italian immigration introduced individuals from regions of southern Italy, including Calabria and Sicily. Some arrivals had pre-established ties to Mafia or 'Ndrangheta traditions. These ties, in turn, became the early seeds of Hamilton's Italian-Canadian underworld. During the Prohibition era, 1920–1933 in the U.S., Canadian alcohol smuggling into American markets proved immensely profitable. Hamilton, like Windsor and other border communities, became hubs of illicit liquor shipments. By the time Papalia reached adulthood, the city had developed a robust tradition of secret partnerships between bootleggers, bookmakers, corrupt law enforcement officials, and emerging organized crime families. Even though Prohibition ended in the early 1930s in the U.S., the networks it spawned did not simply dissolve. Instead, they shifted into smuggling other commodities, such as narcotics, or they consolidated gambling operations catered to local communities. This atmosphere shaped Papalia's teenage years and early adulthood. Hamilton's illicit ecosystem was marked by struggles for territory. Street-level enforcers jostled to protect their boss' financial interests. Alliances came and went, with personal loyalty and reputations for intimidation acting as vital currency. Young men entering this environment had to demonstrate the willingness to use or threaten force. As Papalia matured, he would become well known for intimidation tactics, a knack for strategic alliances, and a propensity toward violence. Climbing the ranks in organized crime. Papalia's initial foray into organized crime likely began with low-level tasks, errands, odd jobs, or muscle work for more established figures. Over time, he demonstrated a reliability and ferocity that garnered the attention of local bosses. Although we lack precise documentation of these early ventures, the consensus among crime historians is that Papalia established relationships with influential Canadian mafia families with ties to both Montreal and New York State. A hallmark of successful mafia power brokers is the ability to forge alliances that extend across city and provincial lines. Papalia is believed to have cultivated these links through personal introductions and mutual acquaintances. He also proved adept at crossing ethnic lines, forging associations not just within Italian circles, but also among other community networks where criminal enterprise was flourishing. On more than one occasion, police investigations hinted at collaborative dealings among Papalia's men, members of the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta, and even American families linked to the Buffalo, New York area. Loan sharking, usury, was one of the earliest revenue streams that Papalia appears to have tapped. Offering quick loans at exorbitant interest rates to gamblers or struggling business owners, the operation was underpinned by violence or threats thereof. It is said that Papalia's reputation for direct, forceful responses to missed payments made him both feared and respected. At the same time, he recognized that overt violence drew the attention of authorities, so balancing intimidation and discretion became a key factor in how he structured his business practices. Gambling, racketeering, and local control. By the late 1950s or early 1960s, depending on the actual birth date timeline, Papalia had reportedly become a key figure in Hamilton's gambling underworld. Illegal card games, horse betting operations, and backroom casinos offered consistent earnings. As the city's appetite for gambling grew, Papalia and other crime figures jockeyed for control. While he never had an unchallenged monopoly, since other criminal groups also sought pieces of the gambling scene, he became integral enough to exact protection fees or a share of profits from designated venues. Extortion rackets sometimes dovetailed with gambling. Venue operators paid a portion of their income to ensure protection, staving off threats from both rival criminals and Papalia's own organization. Those who resisted were dealt with forcibly. According to law enforcement statements from the period, Papalia took care to insulate himself from direct involvement, using trusted associates to handle day-to-day enforcement. Still, rumors claimed that if push came to shove, Papalia would personally make an appearance to reinforce who was in charge. One of the complexities of building a gambling empire was managing law enforcement. Hamilton's police force was not entirely blind to illegal goings-on, but infiltration and a lack of resources sometimes limited their effectiveness. Corruption, if any, remains a difficult topic to verify. However, in many North American cities, it was not unheard of for crime figures to bribe or manipulate lower-level officials, thus easing operational pressures. Papalia's network likely benefited from such clandestine arrangements, though verifiable instances are scattered. A handful of newspaper reports from the 1960s and 1970s hint at suspiciously lenient law enforcement action, fueling speculation of systemic corruption within local institutions. Alliances with American Mafia circles. Ontario is geographically close to major American underworld hubs such as Buffalo, Detroit, and even New York City. Papalia, conscious of the benefits of cross-border cooperation, nurtured relationships with American Mafia figures. The American and Canadian Mafia systems share historical roots in southern Italy's secret societies. Forging alliances often entailed personal trust, introductions by respected intermediaries, and profitable business dealings. Papalia is believed to have brushed shoulders with members of the Buffalo crime family, whose sphere of influence extended over parts of western New York and across the Niagara region. Narcotics trafficking, gambling expansions, and even union infiltration were potential areas of cooperation. Nevertheless, because U.S. law enforcement kept watchful eyes on cross-border activities, participants employed sophisticated methods to obscure the flow of money and illicit goods. Some sources speculate that Papalia's ability to remain discreet earned him favor among American partners, who looked for reliable Canadian contacts. Additionally, historical accounts discuss the infiltration of the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta into both Ontario and the northeastern United States. As a Hamilton resident of Calabrian heritage, Papalia and his associates are sometimes included among those who operated with dual influence, both local, Canadian city networks, and transnational, 'Ndrangheta clans. The lines between formal membership and functional alliances were often blurry. Scholars note that while some individuals held formal rank in the 'Ndrangheta or Sicilian Mafia, others were affiliates who cooperated on an as-needed basis. Key confrontations and turf wars. No figure in organized crime rises to prominence without encountering rivalries. In Hamilton, multiple families vied for a stake in the city's illicit markets, and beyond Hamilton, there were power players in Montreal and Toronto who could potentially encroach on local territories if they sensed weakness. Papalia's reputation was partly built on his success at navigating or outright suppressing these threats. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, sporadic acts of violence, including arson, beatings, and occasional disappearances, were tied in media reports to underworld conflicts. While Papalia was rarely charged in connection with these violent acts, law enforcement often alluded to his involvement or that of his associates. One particular case involved the intimidation of a smaller gambling ring that attempted to operate outside the boundaries Papalia had established. Witnesses, too terrified to testify, only fueled his fearsome image, strengthening Papalia's standing as a man to be obeyed or avoided. Though the specifics are murky, Papalia likely employed a two-pronged strategy, forging alliances with groups amenable to paying tribute or deferring to his leadership, while decisively confronting any that challenged him. This approach minimized direct open warfare, which would draw heavy police attention, and instead perpetuated a climate of fear that compelled others in the illegal sector to keep their distance or acquiesce to his terms. Interaction with law enforcement and the courts. Papalia's rise did not go unnoticed. By the 1970s, local and provincial law enforcement had begun to focus more intently on Hamilton's Mafia activities. Various investigative bodies, including the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and regional police forces, mounted concerted drives to dismantle or disrupt organized crime rings. These efforts involved wiretaps, undercover informants, and specialized organized crime units. Statements from law enforcement officials portrayed Papalia as a high-ranking individual within the Hamilton Mafia web. However, securing convictions proved notoriously difficult. The code of silence, omerta, deterred witnesses from coming forward. Even when individuals were arrested or indicted, they often withheld testimony out of fear of reprisals. Circumstantial evidence conspired with rumors and partial informant testimonies to create a puzzle that prosecutors struggled to piece together into a solid legal case. Nevertheless, Papalia faced charges multiple times during his career. Official records show arrests and allegations relating to extortion, bookmaking, and racketeering. On occasion, he served time, though rarely did he endure extended prison sentences proportionate to the scope of the empire that law enforcement believed he commanded. Whether through legal maneuvering, intimidation of witnesses, or plea bargains, Papalia often emerged with minimal long-term consequences until later in life, when authorities began coordinating larger-scale crackdowns on mafia-linked organizations. Snapshot of criminal enterprises. Although Papalia was closely associated with classic mafia staples, gambling, loan sharking, and protection rackets, there has long been debate about the extent of his involvement in narcotics trafficking. Some writers suggest he mostly focused on gambling and extortion, perceiving drug smuggling as too risky and prone to attracting federal attention. Others argue that he maintained a minimal, though profitable, share in narcotics via trusted intermediaries, ensuring a buffer to avoid direct exposure. Still, the public record indicates that investigations into large-scale drug importation rings in Ontario sometimes mentioned Papalia's name as a peripheral figure or potential silent partner. However, definitive proof of his personal involvement has remained elusive. In interviews and underworld anecdotes, he often framed drug dealing as an inferior or unrespectable racket compared to the traditional forms of organized crime, loan sharking, and illicit gambling. Some observers theorize that this stance might have been partially for show, allowing him plausible deniability even if certain associates were deeply involved. Regardless, there is little dispute that Papalia profited from controlling local or regional gambling circuits. Sports betting, horse racing, and unlicensed card clubs flourished under his dominion. Hamilton's industrial workforce provided a substantial client base for loan sharking operations. Gambling debts typically needed quick financing, and Papalia's organization pounced on these needs with high-interest loans, perpetuating a cycle that further enriched its coffers. The role of family ties and trust. In any mafia structure, family ties and personal loyalty are crucial. Papalia was known to rely heavily on close relatives and longtime associates for critical operational tasks. Trust was paramount, given the constant threat of law enforcement infiltration or betrayal by rivals. According to some accounts, Papalia and his brothers, cousins, or nephews jointly oversaw various segments of illicit enterprise, delegating daily management out to reliable underlings. This tight-knit command chain did not eliminate the potential for internal feuds. All mafia families experience friction, generated by the question of who controls lucrative territories and how profits are divided. Papalia's leadership style, by most accounts, leaned toward authoritarian. He expected unwavering loyalty and swift compliance, and in turn, he offered protection and the potential for substantial financial gain. This hierarchical arrangement mirrored the broader traditions of organized crime families rooted in Italy, where patriarchal oversight and a sacrosanct chain of command define membership obligations. While the reference to family is primarily metaphorical among associates of criminal organizations, literal kinship connections in the Hamilton underworld were not uncommon. The secrecy around Papalia's extended family life means details are sparse. Researchers surmise that over time, several relatives participated in broader operations, though it is notoriously challenging to distinguish rumor from reality. Height of influence and widening scope. During the 1970s and 1980s, Papalia's power was likely at its peak. By this time, he had ostensibly secured loyal lieutenants who handled day-to-day gambling, bookmaking, and collection operations, freeing him to forge higher-level alliances. He started to appear on the radar of journalists and city officials as the figure behind Hamilton's Underworld, though his name was sometimes overshadowed by more flamboyant U.S. Mafia personalities dominating headlines. Further, in this time frame, the city of Hamilton underwent socio-economic changes. Industrial sectors, including steel production, faced economic uncertainties and labor unrest occasionally surfaced. For Papalia's organization, these shifting conditions might have proven fruitful. Economic desperation can feed loan sharking, while unregulated or underground gambling often appeals to those looking for a quick financial fix. Some anecdotal accounts suggest that local businesses, struggling against tighter profit margins, occasionally turn to Papalia's network for financial relief, only to be trapped in crippling cycles of debt. On the law enforcement front, multi-agency task forces became more common. Provincial, federal, and cross-border collaboration aimed to dismantle Mafia strongholds. Even so, the intricacies of Papalia's network and the willingness of underlings to accept prison rather than betray the boss made it difficult for these efforts to result in a definitive takedown. Tensions ran high. Sporadic arrests, while not crippling the organization, did force Papalia and his men to adapt and remain cautious. Challenges, rivalries, and internal pressure. Even as he consolidated power, Papalia faced ongoing pressures. Rival factions in Ontario, particularly from Toronto or Niagara region, sometimes vied for pieces of Hamilton's illicit markets. It is difficult to confirm, but there are suggestions that certain Montreal-based crime families also viewed Hamilton's corridor as a prospective expansion territory. These tensions rarely erupted into high-profile wars. Public shootouts draw too much attention. But behind the scenes, intimidation and strategic shows of force were used to communicate boundaries. Rumblings of dissatisfaction within Papalia's stable may also have surfaced. Younger, ambitious associates, especially those enticed by bigger payouts linked to narcotics, might have questioned the boss's reluctance to pivot more deeply into drug operations. There might have been philosophical or generational differences. For older, more traditional mafia operators, gambling and usury were seen as time-honored business lines. For younger, more brash personalities, drugs represented faster, bigger profits. Papalia's reputed paternalistic approach, insisting on a disciplined chain of command, clashed with some up-and-coming criminals eager to carve out their own paths. Some historians speculate that these internal strains contributed to the environment that would eventually lead to Papalia's downfall. Allegiances in the underworld can shift, particularly when deadlines for large drug shipments loom or when law enforcement pressure compels individuals to turn informant. For Papalia, who had become something of an institution in Hamilton, it was a delicate balance to maintain unity while avoiding reckless entanglements in emerging criminal trends. Late career activities and growing law enforcement scrutiny. As Papalia grew older, law enforcement scrutiny intensified. Wiretaps became more sophisticated. Police, working in tandem with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS on occasion, looked for weak links among Papalia's associates, individuals facing personal crises or seeking immunity from prosecution. Journalists also grew bolder, publishing exposés tying him to alleged racketeering networks. Multiple arrests or indictments occurred in this period, sometimes involving Papalia, at other times ensnaring close associates. In certain instances, investigators gained partial cooperation from informants, though rarely did that cooperation lead to Papalia's direct conviction on the most severe charges. Some local citizens, exasperated by the sense of impunity, called for more aggressive policing. But Hamilton's authorities pointed to limited budgets and the complex legal burden of making charges stick to a well-guarded crime boss. Public persona-wise, Papalia maintained an aura of control. He was not flamboyant in the style of certain American mobsters. He generally preferred to keep a lower public profile. However, occasional media photographs and court appearances revealed a man who projected confidence, sometimes even contempt at the cameras. Documents from the era note that Papalia's posture in court was typically calm and measured, consistent with a man who believed he had the machinery of loyalty and resources to protect him. The murder of Johnny Papalia in 1997. Papalia's death on May 31, 1997, sent shockwaves through Canadian mafia circles. He was shot and killed outside his business office on Railway Street in Hamilton, a location intimately associated with his day-to-day affairs. The nature of the murder, sudden in a relatively public space, contrasted with the discreet image Papalia cultivated. Some sources state he was approached by a barely known associate or a hired gun. One or two witness accounts described a calm exchange of words followed by gunfire. The question of who ordered or orchestrated the killing ignited immediate speculation. Various theories emerged: a rival family's final retribution, a betrayal from within his own circle, or a targeted hit authorized by overarching mafia powers who perceived Papalia as an obstacle to more modern, expansive criminal endeavors. Additionally, some theories hinge on the possibility that younger criminals, looking to make a name for themselves, saw Papalia's old-school methods as antiquated and standing in the way of newfound fortunes in large-scale narcotics. Local and federal authorities investigated vigorously, keen to leverage any potential leads. Though individuals were arrested and some charges brought forward, the murder case remains enveloped in a broader tapestry of underworld silence. The lack of definitive witness cooperation and the complexities of linking evidence to high-level conspirators meant that Papalia's slaying, like many mafia-related homicides, officially ended in partial resolution or protracted legal wrangling. Regardless, Papalia's killing resonated throughout Hamilton. Some believed it signaled a power vacuum that others would scramble to fill. Others took it as a sign that the old guard of the Canadian Mafia was fading, making way for less centralized, more fragmented criminal elements. For law enforcement, the murder was both a culmination of decades of tension and a stark reminder that unchecked power struggles inevitably breed violence. Reactions and immediate aftermath. In Hamilton's Italian-Canadian community, Papalia's death evoked complicated emotions. While some viewed him as a longtime staple, albeit a fearsome one, others saw him as the central cause of persistent violence and corruption. Many residents, tired of the city's reputation as a mafia hotbed, quietly hoped that his removal would diminish organized crime's grip on local business. But the immediate aftermath wasn't as simple as the downfall of a single boss eradicating an entrenched network. On the criminal side, factions reevaluated alliances. Police intelligence indicated potential shifts in leadership. Certain players who had chafed under Papalia's structure might have seized the opportunity to expand their share of the gambling or loan-sharking markets. Yet the city still had older, established families who might coalesce to prevent younger upstarts from making reckless moves. This dynamic interplay of caution and ambition characterized the Hamilton underworld for several years following Papalia's demise. Media coverage was extensive in the days after the killing, focusing on Papalia's background and the broader mafia significance. Journalists recounted high-profile events from his past, emblazoning images of a man who had, for decades, been labeled as Canada's top mafia boss. The attention, ironically, cast a shadow that might have emboldened some investigators while prompting others to suspect that a new wave of underworld competition was taking root. Legacy and continuing influence. Johnny Papalia's story did not end with his death. Historians of crime, investigative journalists, and even pop culture chroniclers continued to analyze and debate his influence on Canada's mafia scene. In Hamilton, older residents still recall the era during which Papalia, or Pops as he was nicknamed, was a well-known if shadowy presence. These recollections range from accounts of intimidation and fear to whispered anecdotes of him showing paternal concern for certain community issues. Police and scholars remain divided on the extent to which Papalia's murder fundamentally weakened Hamilton's organized crime networks. Some argue that removing a centralizing force allowed for chaos, fragmentation, and possibly even more violence as smaller groups fought for power. Others contend that Papalia's downfall opened the door to external criminal factions, such as biker gangs or new waves of international networks, effectively diversifying Hamilton's underworld as never before. Numerous books, articles, and documentaries have attempted to trace Papalia's life arc, though exact truths remain elusive. His name frequently surfaces alongside other notable Canadian crime figures, such as the Cotroni family in Montreal or various offshoots of the Buffalo crime family. Over time, as new data emerges and older case files are declassified, researchers may piece together a more definitive portrait of Papalia's role in shaping the transnational criminal landscape. Broader context: the evolution of organized crime in Canada. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, organized crime in Canada had starkly evolved in response to global pressures. While the traditional Mafia model, dominated by men of Italian heritage operating in close-knit families, retained influence, other groups gained prominence. These included outlaw motorcycle gangs, Eastern European syndicates, West African fraud rings, and Asian triads, a tapestry of criminal organizations exploiting new markets such as synthetic drugs, cybercrime, and money laundering. Papalia's life in many ways exemplified an earlier generation's approach: hierarchical command, reliance on personal intimidation, and a heavy focus on local or regional gambling and extortion. If he had survived into the 21st century, it is uncertain how he would have adapted to the new criminal frontier or whether he would have clung to time-tested methods. Some experts posit that the changing nature of global crime, including the importance of high-tech smuggling routes, would have challenged him significantly, while others believe his capacity for forging alliances could have kept him afloat. Regardless, the narratives of the old school and the new wave intersect, illustrating that organized crime does not remain stagnant. Papalia's story forms a bridge between a more localized, family-driven past and a rapidly globalizing future in which criminals innovate just as quickly as multinational corporations do. His enduring notoriety stems from the outsized impact he had, for a time, on Hamilton and beyond. Cultural depictions and media portrayals. Although he was not as frequently dramatized in international media as some American bosses, Papalia occasionally appears in Canadian crime documentaries and local journalism retrospectives. He has been referenced in books covering broader Mafia influence in Ontario, with some authors labeling him Canada's godfather of the Mafia. Such portrayals mix established facts with anecdotal lore, reinforcing a larger-than-life image that, like many Mafia legends, may blend reality and myth. In Hamilton itself, mention of Papalia can invoke both fear and fascination. Some older residents recollect family stories or personal experiences that paint him as an ominous figure whose approval or disapproval affected local livelihoods. These narratives sometimes merge with localized folk tales, especially given the reluctance of many participants or witnesses to speak openly. As a result, Papalia remains a subject of speculation, reinforcing the sense that crime bosses can become quasi-mythical figures in collective memory. For those exploring Hamilton's historical identity, the Papalia name is inevitably entwined with steel mills, waterfront industries, working-class neighborhoods, and the continuing evolution of the city's downtown core. Mafia tourism, or more accurately, local curiosity, occasionally pops up when crime enthusiasts roam the city's older streets in search of landmarks connected to Papalia's life and death. Ongoing investigations and unresolved mysteries. Though decades have passed since Papalia's murder, it remains an unresolved puzzle for law enforcement historians who quest for a definitive explanation of who ordered the hit and why. Allegations have swirled around rival Hamilton-based groups, expansions from Toronto or Montreal, or even U.S. involvement. Yet, the secrecy in which Papalia shrouded his operations, combined with the Underworld's typical reluctance to rely on official justice, has stymied these lines of inquiry. Occasionally, new pieces of information surface, obtained through the release of old police files or the quiet confessions of individuals seeking closure. Yet these revelations often raise as many questions as answers. With many of Papalia's contemporaries either deceased, in prison, or living in obscurity, the probability of a comprehensive unraveling of the conspiracy behind his murder diminishes further each year. Despite the cold case status, Papalia's story serves as an ongoing focal point for criminologists studying Canadian organized crime patterns. His murder underscores that demise in the Mafia world often comes violently, and more often than not, unexpectedly. This harrowing reality resonates in academic studies, shaping theories about hierarchical transitions, turf consolidation, and the practicalities of silencing a long-standing figure in an insular community. Conclusion: the enduring shadow of Johnny Pops. Papalia. Johnny Pops. Papalia's biography is woven from a combination of concrete legal records, persistent rumors, scholarly research, media reports, and the whispered stories of residents who lived in Hamilton during his decades of influence. He emerges as one of the most powerful mafia figures in Canadian history, a man whose legacy continues to inform discussions about the nature of organized crime within the country. Through gambling rackets, loan sharking, and strategic alliances, Papalia shaped Hamilton's underworld, bridging the gap between local clans and international networks. His reputation was built on a deft mixture of intimidation and business acumen, traits that allowed him to operate for years despite sustained law enforcement attention. In the end, the violent world he inhabited caught up with him in 1997, when the gunfire of an assassin ended his life abruptly in front of the office he frequented. Although partial theories abound, the full truth about the circumstances of his death and the intricacies of his criminal empire remain veiled by the culture of secrecy endemic to mafia circles. In the broader narrative of Canadian organized crime, Papalia symbolizes an era, one marked by heavier reliance on human enforcers, direct violence, and close-knit families passing on underworld traditions. Contemporary readers, scholars, and investigators who revisit his story do so not merely out of historical curiosity, but to glean lessons on how such entrenched systems of illegal enterprise evolve and sometimes violently dissolve over time. Even in death, Papalia's name endures in Hamilton's collective consciousness, a testament to how deeply a single figure can embed himself in the social and criminal fabric of a city. From a humble immigrant family to becoming Canada's most notorious crime boss, Johnny "Pops" Papalia's iron grip on Hamilton's underworld would shape the city's criminal landscape for generations. But like all empires built on fear and violence, his too would crumble. His story serves as a stark reminder that in the shadows of organized crime, even the mightiest can fall. The streets of Hamilton may have changed, but the legacy of Canada's Godfather lives on as a cautionary tale of power, betrayal, and the true cost of a life lived outside the law. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated on more true crime stories. Thanks for watching.